Okay, so in this video, we're going to use the limit definition of the derivative to find the derivative of the sine function. And the first thing we want to do is recall that definition from before. So remember that the f prime of x formula is the limit as delta x goes to 0 of f of x plus delta x minus f of x all divided by delta x. So the derivative in particular of the sine function is going to be the limit as delta x goes to 0 of the sine of x plus delta x minus the sine of x divided by delta x. And so what we want to do in this problem is we want to apply our trig formulas for the addition of two angles for sine. So this is going to be the limit as delta x goes to 0. And remember, the sine of the sum is going to be the sine of x times the cosine of delta x plus the sine of delta x times the cosine of x. And that is still minus a sine of x all divided by our delta x. And it looks like we made a huge mess here, but the strategy is to actually split this up into two limits that are going to exist. And in doing so, we want to think about our final answer. And we'll learn quickly that the derivative of the sine function is the cosine function. So we want to split it apart so that we have those two pieces separate. So this is going to be the limit as delta x goes to 0. And so again, I'm going to have the sine of x times the cosine of delta x minus the sine of x over delta x plus the limit as delta x approaches 0 of the sine of delta x times the cosine of x all over delta x. And again, we're splitting our limit into two, provided, of course, that these limits exist. Next step is to factor. There is a common sine of x in our first limit. That is a constant because it's not changing with delta x. So I'm going to factor out the sine of x, leaving me with the limit as delta x goes to 0 of the cosine of delta x minus 1 divided by delta x. For the second term, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to factor out the constant cosine of x, leaves us with the limit as delta x goes to 0 of the sine of delta x divided by delta x. We now have to recall from the previous section, actually previous chapter, that this first limit, the limit as delta x goes to 0 of the cosine of delta x minus 1 over delta x, that's equal to 0. And then our other limit, if we think back, the limit as delta x goes to 0 of the sine of delta x over delta x is equal to 1. So we end up with the sine of x times the number 0 plus the cosine of x times the number 1. And of course, all that's left from this is the cosine of x. So we have proven that the derivative of the sine function is just our cosine function. A similar derivation can be made for the cosine function. In that case, you'll get the negative of the sine function. So that is how we find the derivative of the sine function using the limit definition of the derivative.